Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
These shows are brought to you by the Open to Hope Foundation in partnership with the Compassionate Friends. Well, Heidi, we have a really interesting guest today because he's a very fine published author and has written a great book and has also, unfortunately, had a child loss and would have kind of brought him into our world. And his book's very inspirational. Heidi, do you want to tell us about our guest?
Sure, I'd love to, Mom. His name is Ken Brack, and Ken is a narrative nonfiction author who, after the death of his 18-year-old son, Mike, founded with his wife Hope Floats Healing and Wellness Center. It's a nonprofit bereavement center in Kingston, Massachusetts. Awakened by the death of his son, reeling in the desolate place that no parent ever expects to be, Ken set out to see how people rebuilt their lives after catastrophic loss, chronicling his interviews and journey in his latest book, Especially for You, Finding a New Purpose After Unspeakable Loss. Here it is.
It's a great book. I've got a copy too. Interesting stories.
It's wonderful. And he also has a YouTube. You can go and look at some of the things he's been doing, some of the people that he interviewed. And I also have to say his center, Hope Floats Healing and Wellness, is just a beautiful place. And thank you for everything that you're doing, Ken, and welcome to our show.
Heidi, thanks for having me, and Gloria as well. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you on. And you've written other books. You've been writing for years. You were high school or a college?
Couple of careers, a former full-time journalist, and I taught English for a number of years at a high school in Boston, and I've been in publishing and needed to really write this book in the years after, as we were trying to make sense out of my son's death in 2002, and that led to creating Especially for You, Finding a New Purpose After Catastrophic Loss.
Wow. Now tell us about your son. I know our audience is going to want to know a bit about your son.
Sure. Michael was my oldest son. He was 18 years old. He was just one of those bright lights when he walked into a room, and was a great, terrific athlete in high school, a soccer player, just an electric player. And he had an electric personality too. And he was finding his way, wasn't in college yet, but was heading there. And what happened to Mike, he was out with three buddies. They were underage drinking, and there was a horrific crash. Mike was not the driver, but both he and one of his buddies, who was celebrating a 20th birthday, died in the crash. And of course, our family was reeling. We have two other children now, young adults, and we stammered through it. But what really started to happen in some months afterwards, after our shock, and after we had the information, started to get our arms around what really had happened. They were underage drinking at a bar, and there were a lot of issues around that. But what our initial response, which led to creating the bereavement center eventually, was to, kind of a primal cry that many of us going through this may have, how can I prevent another family? How can we help another family going through this kind of ordeal, if not preventing it in the first place? So my wife and I, briefly, we got involved with some great other parents in our regional school district, trying to bring drunk driving prevention, safe driving programs to the school district. Did that for a few years. But then my wife, Denise, really had this vision that went, right alongside this of, can we create a place, a safe place for other families where people no one's in the same boat per se, that cliche, but walking, a somewhat similar road where they can be together, find accompaniment, and maybe find some solace and ways to grow and strategies to help other families who've lost a child. It started in that direction. So we eventually created this nonprofit called Hope Floats Healing and Wellness Center, as you mentioned. We're in our ninth.
I love that name, don't you, Heidi? Hope Floats.
Yes.
Yeah, Denise. We did not know about the movie at the time. It came on. My soulmate, my wife Denise, just organically came up to her, and we ran with it, and we are south of the city of Boston, and we serve a lot of communities in the southeastern part of the state, including Greater Boston, and we're one of some really fine centers, children's-based focused bereavement centers in Massachusetts. We're a relative newcomer compared to some others like the Children's Room in Arlington, Mass, for one. But we're part of that network.
Oh, it's a network. That's nice. It's important
That
to
is.
network nowadays.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's helped a lot. And
Have you get connected with the Compassionate Friends at all?
we were at the national conference going on 2 years ago. Initially, Denise went to a couple of Compassionate Friends meetings. It was a little bit far from our home at the time, and just with other things, so we weren't that involved. But we've come to really appreciate the work and certainly the community.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to way back, and then I want to come to your doing your book, back to some of the feelings you had after your son was killed, because I know our audience is wondering how you've dealt with those and what kind of feelings did you come up with, and then what did you find out from other people in the book, and what have you learned?
Sure. Um, you know, that isolation, that acute sense of now um, we're this other, we're in this other category, as probably many of your viewers. In my heart goes out to others who are going through this. That sense of who do we turn to, where do we turn? But, other than going to kind of a clinical setting, and I have nothing against an institutional setting per se, and we actually have counselors, licensed therapists at our center, but it's in a location, it's a home, and it's a peaceful, restorative place. So that has helped bridge the isolation. Also, really the struggle of how can we stay connected to our son? Is that even possible? As we're trying to just make sense of the cause of his death, in the first place, but then leading from there, how, Mike's life, like so many other young people, was cut short capriciously. So while you're trying to deal, and especially with me as a dad, I had my own, guilt around this of, his life wasn't fulfilled. Well, how can I stay connected with him in a way that's, his legacy, appreciating what his life brought to so many other people and his legacy, and then doing something that's in part remembering him, but really creating something new.
I'm seeing twofold things with Ken thing here. There's an idea that people want to stay connected, and how to do that now that the person has physically died, stay connected in a new and different way, and then, like you said, create something out of it in order to have some kind of meaning around the loss.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm thinking, because I think it's important that we make some kind of meaning, not that they were meant to die, because that's not what I'm talking about, but how do we make the world better in their honor and their legacy, and pay tribute to them going forward. I know that Scott is my guiding light, and I know that you have done this with Michael through Hope Floats, because you are changing so many lives and helping so many people out there. And I love the Hope Floats Center, because it is so welcoming and so inviting. Like you said, it's not a sterile institution. It's a place where you want to go. You can see that hope and healing takes place there just by looking at it.
It does, and I appreciate that. And Michael is a part of that. His presence, however different people may think about someone's spiritual presence, he's there. It's not always obvious every day, but like for my role, I help with all the planning and financial stuff, budgeting, but I also take care of the buildings and the grounds. And it's a way for me to, it's not really work. Usually it's a way to kind of give back, and Mike's presence is there. But just to step back, of course, and this leads into my book a little bit, that what we did, Denise and I, we kind of became activists in a sense while we were seekers, just going through the spiritual questions and trying to open ourselves up to what are the possibilities of staying connected with our son. Of course, you're questioning, the meaning of life, your identity as a family has been thrown out the window. But we know that not everyone, or maybe many couples or adults need to become activists. There are so many other ways. Others just, and what I'm sort of getting at here is my book. My book tells the stories of a number of different families who have a variety of responses to this kind of really tough stuff. And for some, it's just this, this heightened appreciation of life right in front of us, or of community, just really quiet things, or it's finding a way to new avenues to be spiritual, or in your faith, or even rejecting the traditional faith and going in another direction. So those are some of the responses.
And when you interviewed all these people, because I know you had a lot of interviews you did, was there anything that you found that was surprising, or not necessarily?
That's a great question. The breadth of responses, and I'll just tell a little bit about the book and how I went about it. Several years after we lost Mike, as I was just doing a lot of reading and kind of my own spiritual searching, if you will. I became inspired by the stories of everyday people sometimes in different places across this country, doing some extraordinary things, maybe running with the legacy of a loved one, perhaps being a real activist, going into the very forces that caused, whether it's disease or a sudden calamity, mass shooting, committing themselves to address those forces, or also just acts of service, reaching out to help humanity. So I became a seeker of those accounts or stories, if you will, and wanted to tell them. And what propelled me was I needed to tell these people's stories to make any sense of our own.
Mm-hmm.
Because as Mike's dad, I had so much to figure out.
Yeah.
So
I wondered what you found out about yourself.
Wow. Well, I resolved a lot of my own flaws, and some things, just as a dad who's lost his oldest son, when you may feel like, oh, if I had had that other conversation with him, if we had, in some way, and I know there's little control over this, it had, so he wasn't in the car that night, if he hadn't, if he hadn't made those poor choices along with his friends. So I struggled with some of that, but I think I learned that I had to face both, some of my flaws, perceived or otherwise, and to really, really face the causes of Mike's death, where they went. I won't go into it here, but where they went to underage drink. There was a lot of politics and just seediness in that area. And as I used to be an investigative reporter, so I have the skill set. I knew, I went at it. I went at it really hard. I went at it as Mike's dad, but sometimes I crossed the line into, like, am I a journalist or am I, Mike's father? Eventually I reconciled that, and just, to be his dad, and to put some of it to resolve to the extent that I could, not closure, but
the thing about it, Ken, in the investigative journalist piece, is that you were there as his dad, but you were also there to prevent any other kids from ever having this happen to them.
Trying to. Yeah.
I love that you had that skill set, because then you could go at it hard and say, okay, what's going on that these kids are able to get into these places when they're not of age? And obviously this is happening at a big level every single day. We know it is. What he did was not abnormal at all.
Right.
So yes, who's letting these kids in and who's giving them alcohol and all that? And I like that you because you are saving lives in doing that. You don't know the impact that's had. It's had an impact.
I hope so. I believe it has, even if it's limited, that's okay. And for me, I needed to let it go because it was churning me up a little bit.
Yeah.
And I mean that's an issue around the wrath, how much we take on, the anger. One of the principal other men in the book whose story I tell, he has to deal with his rightful wrath at a convicted killer who killed his daughter while she was in her dormitory bed at Lehigh University in
Wow.
1985.
Wow.
But he, eventually he let go of some of that, and it brought some healing to him and his wife and the family. But that was a long process. So part of part of my book, spending time with some of these other families, goes into these, the real switchbacks, if you will, the back and forth and the low points. But
Mhm.
how do we come out of it?
That's a key question.
What's the trajectory towards finding solace, to finding connection, keeping connections with loved ones, etc.
I think
So
that's key.
yeah, so in this book, you're giving. If I was to read your book, I would read wonderful stories, inspirational. What kinds of tips would I take away for myself to help myself through the grieving process?
Sure. Great question. And just to introduce, the book is narrative driven. So I am, telling the stories of these other families, and it's literally, bookmarked on both ends, if you will, or anchored with our ordeal and our response. Some of the main thing, there's several, but I think one, as you well know, that it's every parent or every adult, every family member, I think, should, listen to his or her intuition and heart, and everyone follows their own path in dealing with this. But I think my main sort of takeaway from these families is keeping those of us who keep our hearts open to our grief, who are inquisitive, and it may be around these questions like we've talked about, trying to stay connected, um, or looking into the the forces of what happened to our child, and being open to trying to make meaning from their loss. For others who have to shutter the room and walk away, and that's okay. There's no judgment. But for those who, even in a sense, continue to plunge into the questions, the ordeal, the capricious event, if you will, itself, enough so that they had their arms around it, and then dealing with all the complexities, the contradictions, the paradoxes in their lives as they tried to become activists, or have lasting memorials to their son or daughter. So many of us do memorial scholarships and things like that, which can be wonderful, but those have a cost every year. We did a soccer tournament for our son for 7 years, and it became this incredible community event because we have guys and girls played on co-ed teams, and it became this day of them just joining in camaraderie and also tribute to Mike, even those who didn't know him. But there was a cost to that. So I'm coming back to my wife and I, we need to just keep being open and looking at that and examining. This is great, yet at some point we need to let this go,
Right.
and just keep having those conversations. While
How long has it been for you?
Yes, it's been 15 years.
Yeah, yeah.
2002.
I'm just really fascinated in hearing you talk because it's so interesting to hear your process and going through. And I think that, Heidi, to me, one of the biggest hopes that you bring to people, frankly, is that they can see that there is a process and you can keep moving along. Even after this many years, you're doing fabulous things, and I think enjoying them.
Yeah, we certainly are. I mean, as as anyone who's involved in the nonprofit world or doing any, similar work around bereavement, as you both well know, it's there can be a lot of weight at times. Denise, my wife, is the director of our small nonprofit, and she wears too many hats, and we're both working on that. But yet, and here this leads to another thread in the book. What someone else called, this was after the 9/11 attacks in New York City, and this was actually a minister down at St. Paul's Chapel right beside the World Trade Center site, about 15 months or so after, or wasn't that much, but some months after the attacks, when St. Paul's Chapel had been turned into a center nurturing the first responders who would come in there for lunch or taking a break, sleeping on the pews, getting massages, coffee, all this. He called it, what was going on there, reciprocity of gratitude, meaning
Wow.
the firefighters, the utility workers, all the first responders would come in, and they were so gracious for the volunteers who were feeding them and giving them a massage and a break. But the volunteers, this circle, were all in awe of what these responders were doing. And that was part of the spirit of the initial response throughout this country, the unity after 9/11. That's one piece of my book goes into some families with this. So that reciprocity of gratitude also plays out in a small nonprofit like ours at Hope Floats, where, as I just mentioned, my wife wears too many hats, and we're trying to give her a break, but we're infused by new energy all the time. People, bereaved parents like ourselves who've gone through the program, so many people want to give back. They want to be asked. They crave to do something, and that's a way for them to pitch in. And that doesn't mean they're going to go off and start their own, big deal. Doesn't matter. You do what you can, right? But that whole reciprocity just really resonated with me. And some of the stories, this is about 1/4 of the book on the 9/11 families. It doesn't matter that, that was going on 18 years ago. It's
Still going on. Heidi certainly knows that because she worked with the 9/11 families at a
okay.
study at Columbia, right, Heidi?
Columbia.
Yeah, I worked with I worked with firefighter families for 10 years after 9/11 in New York City, and I think that some of what you're saying resonates in the idea that our grief is constantly transforming. So I feel like, you can do things for a while and then you can go do something else, and that's okay. We don't have to set up things that last forever. I think that's part of the healing. And I also feel like being of service, like you have been, and like, my mom and I have been, helps us in our own grief and helps us to heal. When we turn our grief out towards service and out of ourselves, it really does help in the healing process.
Absolutely. And transformation, although it sounds like a buzzword or even a cliche perhaps to some, that's really what my book is about. It's the wrenching process. It's the ups and downs. It's brutally honest in parts, but it's, to me and hopefully to people who read it, it's the arc of coming out of it. And that directly relates to the work at our small nonprofit. And I wouldn't say everybody goes through it feels transformed, no way,
Right.
but finding some solace. Maybe it starts with how the heck am I going to negotiate the holidays, my first holidays, the birthdays, all the things we have to deal with, to forming a new community, even with say, one of our groups is around suicide loss and all the stigmas attached to that. And it's damning. And I don't know, but some of these moms and dads or sisters, brothers, they'll carry on and go out for coffee once in a while. And there's an alignment.
I love that, Ken, because they're grieving a community, which is so important because it normalizes what we're going through. And I think early on, it is normal just to say, how am I going to survive? Because that's where we all are. And then eventually, someday, hopefully, with organizations like yours and ours, it'll be not only how am I going to survive, but how am I going to thrive? And during all this, remain connected. Because we are connected. You are connected with Michael. I'm connected with Scott. We always will be.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Ken, we want to thank you for being on the show today and tell us, I know I saw that all the proceeds from your book go to Hope Floats. And I certainly want to encourage everybody to get that book. and they can get it on Amazon, I guess. Where would you get it, and what's your website?
Sure. Um, your local bookstore can order it through the major catalogs, and the book is on Amazon as well. My author's site is kenbrack.com, especially for you finding a new purpose after catastrophic loss. And I appreciate the chance to share that with people. And my hope is that pieces of it, if not the whole, will speak to each reader. You will find, whether you're a mom or dad, sister, brother, other relative, I think you'll find something that will touch you. The book has a lot of breadth, and it's not. There are some parts that that are heavy, so it might, you don't even have to go through all of it if that's not the right time for you. So.
And your story is woven through it too, which makes it very interesting. Well, we want to thank everybody for listening and watching the show today. And we always want to remind you, Heidi and I do, that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own. And please visit us at opentohope.com.